So you might have heard about the professor who literally wrote the book on honesty being accused of fabricating data, but that story has gotten so much worse. So in one of Ariely and his collaborators' most famous experiments, they partnered with a car insurance company to show that if you had people sign an honesty pledge at the beginning of a form rather than at the end, they were more likely to provide accurate information. So in 2021, another group of researchers revealed that they had dug into the actual data from that experiment and determined that there was no way it could be real. And at the time, Ariely's response was that he'd gotten the data from the insurance company, and if there were irregularities in it, that wasn't on him. And that was kind of a dead end because there wasn't really a way to prove who had messed with the data. But now there have been some developments. So recently, those same researchers revealed that they had dug into the data from experiments from one of Ariely's co-authors on the honesty work, Francesca Gino, including a different experiment in that exact same paper, and they determined that some of that data is also almost certainly fabricated. How they figured this out is actually pretty interesting. Gino's employer, Harvard, launched an investigation, put her on administrative leave, and now she's suing Harvard and those researchers for $25 million for defamation, but that's not all. So NPR's Planet Money is doing a story about all this. They reach out to that car insurance company and convince them to look at the original data. And they made a statement that the data they provided to Ariely was not what was used in that experiment. And if true, that means that someone involved did mess with that data. Buckle up. This is how an allegedly massive scientific fraud was busted, in part because of fonts. Here I'm talking about the 2012 study that was published in PNAS and retracted in 2021. So briefly, the finding of the study again was that people are more likely to provide accurate information if you ask them to sign an honesty pledge before they provide that information as opposed to after. So this was a field experiment with a car insurance company where they asked almost 15,000 people to provide the odometer readings for their car under those two different conditions. So in the years that followed, a bunch of replication attempts for this finding failed, including by a bunch of the original authors, including Ariely. And in 2020, they published this paper where they basically concluded that the original finding must have been wrong. But as part of that paper, they released not only the data for the replication attempts, but also the original data in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's where these folks come in. This is a group of researchers. I will refer to them as Data Colada because that is this blog. You can go here for more detail on all of this. So they analyzed the data and found a bunch of weird anomalies. Anomaly number one, a completely implausible distribution of mileage. So if you had a data set of miles driven over some period of time, you would expect the distribution to look something like this, right? This is from the UK Department of Transportation. So say in a year, a small number of people will drive, say, 500 miles. A small number of people will drive, say, 30,000 miles, and most people will kind of be in the middle. Like I drive 5,000 to 10,000 miles a year. In this data, it looks like this. It's basically a uniform distribution between 0 and 50,000. That is like the same number of people drove 500 miles as drove 10,000 miles as drove 40,000 miles. And it also ends abruptly at 50,000 miles. So the researchers concluded that the most plausible explanation for how this data looks is that a uniformly distributed random number capped at 50,000 was added to some baseline mileage for each car, which is super easy to do in Excel. The second anomaly they noticed was that a bunch of numbers weren't rounded when they would have expected them to be, because people tend to round large numbers, and these were self-reports. Like, yeah, a bunch of people might have looked at the odometer and then written it down exactly, but a lot of people also would have just ballparked it, and these were not. But random number generators don't round. And then the fonts. So a weird thing is that the entries in this Excel spreadsheet appeared in two different fonts, Cambria and Calibri. And so the Data Colada folks looked at the differences between the data that was in one font versus another. So they concluded that original data entries were what appeared in Calibri. And then those entries were duplicated with the transformation of the random number generator, and those were the ones that appeared in Cambria. One of the reasons I knew this was because the Cambria entries were the ones that weren't rounded. Again, this paper was retracted by PNAS, so clearly they agreed with this analysis. And this was just that first paper. There's more. All right, next up in the saga of how to uncover alleged massive scientific fraud using Microsoft Excel. Now we turn to Francesca Gino, who was put on administrative leave from Harvard and is suing them as well as the researchers who uncovered the data fabrication that I'm about to talk about for $25 million. So the 2012 paper about honesty that was retracted due to pretty irrefutable evidence that data that came from a car insurance company had been fabricated in some way, see previous video, fonts. That paper actually had more than one experiment in it. So all of the experiments were testing the same thing, whether the placement of an honesty pledge on a form, like at the top or the bottom, influenced whether people were more honest. But in addition to odometer readings, there was also a study that asked people to do math problems and then report how many they got correct, with a condition where they reported this signing at the top or the bottom. And they were also being paid for how many math problems they got correct. So what they found was that putting the signature at the top instead of the bottom statistically significantly lowered the number of people who were over-reporting. And this study, the data collection was done by Francesca Gino. So following the revelations from the car insurance data, the Data Colada researchers dug into the data from this experiment as well, and they found something really weird. So look at how this data is sorted. It's by condition, where the two conditions were signing at the top or the bottom, and by participant number. But some of the participant numbers are out of order, those ones that are in yellow. And basically, there's no way that you could sort this data to create this order of participants, which means that they had to have been moved by hand somehow. And coincidentally, all of the out of order participants show very strong effects that supported the study's hypothesis. But this wasn't just speculation. They were able to show the data had been moved around. So I did not know this, but Excel remembers, which is very handy for data forensics. But Excel has to keep a record of what order calculations are being done in, which means that it has to keep a record of whether cells containing formulas have been moved. The Data Colada folks were able to show that some of these entries had been moved from one condition to another in a way that supported the author's hypothesis. So this means that that 2012 paper actually had two different studies with data that was falsified in different ways, possibly by different people, which is wild. So the Data Colada folks also looked into more papers where Gino had done the data collection, and they found 3 more with significant anomalies. They wrote a report based on their findings and gave it to Harvard, who did their own internal investigation and apparently produced a 1,200-page report before putting Gino on administrative leave. All right, next episode of Law and Order: Fake Data Detectives. So after the Data Colada researchers found evidence of data tampering in the honesty experiment run by Gino, they started looking at some of her other papers. And I want to say that they were very careful to point out that, to their knowledge, these are all studies where the data collection was done by Gino and not by her co-authors. I'm not going to go into as much detail about the actual studies, but just tell you how they figured out that the data was falsified in each case. So one study was a survey of Harvard students, and the survey asked for demographic information, which you can see here in the data set. So one of the questions was year in school, which is this column at the end here. Now, it was open answer, so there were a lot of different ways that you could answer that question. Some people wrote like senior or sophomore. Some wrote the year that they were graduating, and a bunch of students inexplicably wrote Harvard. Now, someone could have read the question wrong. Even a couple of people might have read the question wrong, but this is a lot of people to read the question wrong in the same way. And you probably will not be surprised to hear at this point in the story that all of the data entries that said Harvard for this answer exceptionally strongly supported the study's hypothesis. The next example in a different study was similar to the case in the last video. A bunch of entries in the data were out of order, and the out of order entries strongly supported the author's hypothesis. This last example I think is particularly interesting. So this was a study about mindset, and one of the questions had participants write 5 or 6 words about their feelings about something. And what the participants wrote was not actually in the paper at all. It probably wasn't even analyzed, because the purpose of that question was just to jog participants' memories before they were asked like multiple choice quantitative questions about the thing that they were remembering. They were answering questions about the same event, so their answers should have been correlated. Okay, so say like you were asked right now, give me a few words to describe how this video you're watching makes you feel. So you write some words, and then the next question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good does this video make you feel, where 10 is the best? So So you would assume that someone who wrote words like lousy, horrible, depressed would then give a very low quantitative rating for how good the video made them feel. But if they used words like amazing, awesome, so good, they would give a high rating for how good the video made them feel. That's the anomaly that they found systematically in this data. The equivalent of someone writing, "This is the best video I've ever seen," and then rating it a 1 for how good it made them feel. So the speculation here is that someone changed the quantitative responses, but didn't bother to change the words for those same participants because they weren't even analyzed. Data Colada researchers analyzed the words and basically remapped the quantitative responses based on the words that they used and reran the analysis, and the study actually came up with the opposite effect of the hypothesis that initially was supported in the data. And another thing I'll add here is that the Data Colada researchers speculated that Harvard, who again created a 1,200 page report about these papers, had access to data that they did not have because they could have accessed the original Qualtrics files and confirmed that the data actually had been changed. And also, again, Gino is suing the Data Colada researchers and Harvard for $25 million for defamation, maintaining her innocence. Her lawsuit points to the possibility of sloppy record keeping or even possible malfeasance from student research assistants. And I really do not like the idea of student researchers being thrown under the bus here. But in any case, Harvard did its own internal investigation and then put her on unpaid leave. So that is where it stands. I think that this story about fabricated data says something about incentive structures in academia. So as this Fortune article points out, both Ariely and Gino have had incredibly successful academic careers. And part of the success comes from that original, flashy, cool research finding about how we can convince people to be more honest. If they had done that study and had null findings, nobody would have cared, but they would have done the exact same work. And I'm reminded of this political science scandal from 2015 where it turns out that a graduate student had completely fabricated an entire data set of survey data. And this study had a similarly cool, flashy finding that if political canvassers revealed that they were gay, they were more likely to change people's minds on gay marriage over the long term. This study was covered on NPR. This graduate student got a job offer at an incredibly prestigious school, basically based on this one study. And would those things have happened if he had actually done the research and just gotten an uninteresting null finding? I don't know. Now, as a researcher, I truly do think that for the most part, science research can be trusted. But I also think that it's incredibly important that we are doing the work to root out academic dishonesty when it's happening.